The estate sprawled before Elena like something from a fever dream, all shadowed stone and Winterberry gardens, wrought iron gates that seemed to drink the twilight rather than merely stand within it. She pressed her palm against the taxi window, watching her breath fog the glass, and wondered if desperation always felt as much like falling. The driver had gone quiet 10 minutes ago when they turned off the main road, perhaps sensing the rawness of this place, or perhaps simply bored with her nervous chatter about the salary, the live-in position, the child who needed constant care. She'd stopped talking when the mansion came into view, when she'd realized that some silences were their own kind of warning. The advertisement had been specific in its vagueness. Private household. References required. Discretion essential. Elena had provided references from families who'd barely noticed her, letters of recommendation from people who'd never quite met her eyes. She was good at being invisible, had made an art of it through 3 years of scraping together rent, of choosing between groceries and her mother's medication, of smiling while her bank account dwindled to double digits. The salary they'd offer was obscene. She'd said yes before they'd finished explaining the duties. Now, stepping on the gravel that crunched like breaking bones, she understood why the money was so good. The house watched her, not metaphorically, not in the way that old buildings sometimes seem to wear, but actually watched from the tension that prickled across her skin like static electricity. She could feel eyes somewhere in those dark windows, could sense something ancient and patient taking her measure. The logical part of her brain, the part that had gotten her through nursing school on scholarships and spite, suggested she get back in the taxi. The desperate part, the part that had listened to her mother's labored breathing over the phone last night, picked up her single suitcase and walked toward the door. IT opened before she could knock. The woman who stood in the doorway wore black that seemed to absorb light, her face pale and sharp as carved marble. Miss Reyes. Punctual. Come in. Not a greeting, not quite a command, but something between that made Elena's spine straighten automatically. She stepped across the threshold and felt the temperature drop 20 degrees. Not a draft. This was deeper, older, the kind of cold that lived in bone rather than air. I'm Mrs. Crane. I manage the household. The woman closed the door with a sound like a crypt ceiling. The master is occupied. I'll show you to your quarters and explain your duties. She moved through the entrance hall with the gliding efficiency of someone who'd walked these corridors 1,000 times, and Elena followed, trying not to stare at the artwork on the walls. Dark oils and darker frames, faces that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, landscapes of forest that had never seen sunlight. The child, Mrs. Crane said, not slowing, is 7 years old. He doesn't speak. Hasn't spoken in 3 years. You're not here to fix that. She climbed a staircase that curved like a spine, her hand barely touching the banister. You're here to keep him alive. Elena's nursing training kicked in, questions forming automatically. What's his condition? What medications? No medications. They'd reached a landing where the hallway stretched in 2 directions, both equally dark. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't eat regular food. Your job is to be present, to keep him calm, to ensure he doesn't hurt himself or others. Mrs. Crane stopped at the door, her hand on the knob, and finally looked at Elena directly. Her eyes were the color of winter ice. Can you do that, Miss Reyes? Can you sit with a child who might be a monster and not run screaming? The question should have sent Elena back down those stairs. Instead, she thought of her mother's voice on the phone, tired and trying not to sound it, saying the insurance had denied the claim again. She thought of the check they deposited in her account, enough to cover 6 months of treatment. She thought how good she'd always been at seeing through surfaces, at finding the human underneath the horror. Yes, she said, and meant it, Mrs. Crane studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Your room. She opened the door to reveal a space that was unexpectedly warm, a fire already burning in a stone fireplace. Heavy curtains drawn against windows Elena suspected faced something she wasn't ready to see. The bed was old but beautiful, the kind of furniture that had witnessed centuries. You'll start tomorrow at sunset. He's calmer in the evenings. Avoid the east wing entirely. Don't ask questions of the other staff. There isn't any. And Miss Reyes. She paused at the doorway. If you see the master, don't stare. He doesn't care for it. Then Elena was alone with her racing heart and the knowledge that she crossed into a world with different rules, where children didn't sleep and households had wings you couldn't enter and masters didn't like being looked at. She sat on the edge of the bed and felt its solid reality beneath her, grounding her. Whatever this was, she'd survived worse. She'd survived her father leaving, her mother's diagnosis, the casual cruelty of people who saw right through her. She could survive this too. The fire crackled, and in its wavering light, she could almost convince herself she'd made the right choice. The child's room was at the end of the western corridor, behind a door that looked like all the others but felt different, heavier somehow, as if it held back pressure rather than simply dividing space. Mrs. Crane had left her there at sunset, had handed her a key on a silver chain, and departed without further instruction. Elena stood in the hallway as shadows lengthened, as the house settled into itself with sounds like breathing, and tried to steady her hands enough to unlock the door. When she finally did, when she pushed it open and stepped inside, she found a room that looked almost normal. A child's room, with books on shelves and toys in careful arrangements, and a bed with blankets that might have been slept in, except the window had bars. And the toys were all turned to face the door, as if watching. And in the corner, in a chair too large for him, sat a boy with his father's eyes. She knew they were his father's eyes, though she'd never seen the master of the house. Knew it the way you know things in dreams or in the moment before waking. They were too old for his small face, too aware, the color of blood in moonlight. He watched her enter, watched her close the door behind her, watched her cross the room with steps she forced to be calm. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched with an intensity that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't. "Hello," Elena said, pulling a chair to sit a respectful distance away. "I'm Elena. I'm going to be staying with you for a while." Nothing, not a flicker of response. "Mrs. Crane says you don't talk. That's okay. I talk enough for both of us." She smiled, the same smile she'd used with frightened patients in the hospital, the one that said, "I see you and you're safe." "I'm not very good at staying quiet anyway." The boy's head tilted a fraction, a movement so slight she almost missed it. His hands were folded in his lap, small and pale and perfectly still. Before I continue with this story, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video if you want more stories like this. Write in the comments which city you're watching from, and then we'll continue with the story. He wore clothes that looked expensive and uncomfortable, a button-down shirt, pressed trousers, clothes for a portrait, not for play. She wondered when he'd last played, or if he ever had. "I'm from Texas," she continued, settling into her chair. "Near Houston. It's hot there, nothing like here. I used to complain about the heat, but I think I'd take it back now if I could." She kept her voice light, conversational, the way she'd talked to patients who were too sick to respond but needed the sound of normalcy. "My mama always said I was born talking. First word at 8 months, full sentences by 18 months, never stopped since." Another small movement. His fingers flexed slightly, pressing into the fabric of his trousers. Progress, maybe, or nothing. It was impossible to tell. "She's sick," Elena said, surprising herself with the honesty. "My mama. That's why I'm here, really. The salary. I needed to help her, and this job pays enough to cover her treatment." She met his eyes, those terrible ancient eyes in a child's face. "So I guess we're both stuck in places we didn't choose, doing things we don't want to do. That's something we have in common." The boy's lips parted, not to speak, but as if he'd forgotten how, as if the words were there but the pathway to them had closed long ago. Elena felt something crack in her chest, some wall she'd built to keep her job clinical and her heart safe. This wasn't just a child who needed supervision. This was a child who was drowning in silence, trapped in whatever had stolen his voice. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said quietly, "and I'm not going to be scared of you. I don't know what happened to you or why you're here like this, but I'm going to sit with you every evening. And maybe eventually, if you want, you can show me who you really are." She stayed until dawn, talking about nothing and everything. Her mother's garden, the terrible hospital coffee, the cat she'd had as a child who thought he was a dog. The boy never moved except for those small tells, the finger flexes, the occasional head tilt. But he listened. She could feel him listening, could sense his attention like a physical thing, desperate and careful and achingly lonely. When the sun began to threaten the horizon, when the bars on the window cast shadows across the floor, she stood. "I'll be back tonight," she promised, and found she meant in a way that had nothing to do with the salary. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and she leaned against it, exhausted and wired, and feeling like she'd just survived something profound. The hallway was empty, lit by lamps that hadn't been on before, and at its far end stood a man who watched her with eyes the exact shade of the sun's. He was tall, impossibly tall, or perhaps the corridor made him seem so, dressed in black that made the shadows look pale by comparison. His face was beautiful in the way that dangerous things were beautiful, all sharp angles and cruel elegance, ageless and cold. He didn't move, didn't speak. Simply stood there with stillness that was more unsettling than any motion. Elena remembered Mrs. Crane's warning. Don't stare. She dropped her gaze but didn't run, even though every instinct screamed at her to do exactly that. "Miss Reyes." His voice was winter itself, frost and darkness and the sound of ice cracking. Not loud, but it filled the hallway, filled her head, vibrated in her bones. "Mrs. Crane informed me of your arrival." "Sir." Her own voice sounded small, human, fragile as glass. She kept her eyes on the floor, on his shoes, expensive, polished, perfectly still. "I've just finished my first evening with your son." Silence. Long enough that she risked a glance up and found him studying her with an expression she couldn't read. Not anger, not curiosity. Something else. Something that made her feel simultaneously invisible and utterly exposed. "He let you stay." Not a question. A statement that seemed to surprise him. "He hasn't allowed anyone in that room for 2 years. The last nurse lasted 4 hours before she fled." Elena's heart hammered, but she held her ground. "He's lonely and scared. Of course he's defensive. You presume to know my son's mind after one evening." The temperature dropped further. Warning, clear and cold. She'd overstepped. "No, sir. I presume nothing. I only know what I saw." She met his eyes then, couldn't help it, and the impact of his gaze was like falling into frozen water. Red, ancient, furious, and underneath all that, desperate. "He needs someone who'll stay. So I'm staying." The silence stretched. She'd broken Mrs. Crane's rule, had stared, had probably just ended her employment. But she couldn't look away from what she saw beneath his terrible beauty. Couldn't unsee the father and the monster. "You're not afraid." He moved closer, gliding rather than walking, until he stood near enough that she could feel the cold radiating from him like a physical force. "Why?" "I am afraid," Elena corrected. Her hands were shaking, had been shaking since the moment she'd seen him, but her voice stayed steady. "I'm terrified, but fear doesn't mean I run. It means I pay attention." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Mrs. Crane was right about you. You see things others don't." He tilted his head, studying her. "What do you see when you look at me, Miss Reyes?" The question felt like a test, like everything depended on her answer. So she told the truth. A father who loves his son, but doesn't know how to help him. And someone who's been alone so long you've forgotten what it's like to be seen. His expression froze, locked somewhere between shock and something rawer, more dangerous. For a moment she thought she'd gone too far, thought he might hurt her or throw her out or worse. Then he stepped back, distance reasserting itself, and when he spoke again his voice was controlled, emotionless. "Your presence seems to calm him. Continue your work." He turned to leave, then paused. "But understand this. If you harm him, if you fail him, if you prove to be like all the others who saw only the monster and not the child, there is nowhere in this world you could run that I wouldn't find you." It should have been terrifying. It was terrifying. But underneath the threat, she heard what he wasn't saying. "He's all I have. Please don't hurt him like everyone else has." She understood that kind of love, the desperate, fierce protection of someone who couldn't protect themselves. She lived it every time her mother's breathing grew labored, every time another treatment failed. "I won't hurt him," she said. "I promise." He looked at her one last time, those terrible, beautiful eyes seeing through her, seeing everything. Then he was gone, vanished into shadow so completely she might have imagined him, except for the cold that lingered in the hallway and the racing of her heart. Elena walked back to her room on legs that barely held her, closed the door, and sat on the bed until the shaking stopped. She'd been hired to watch a silent child who wasn't quite human. She'd been warned by a housekeeper who moved like a ghost. And she'd just met the vampire king himself, had looked him in the eyes and told him she saw his loneliness she'd either made the best decision of her life or signed her own death warrant. Time would tell which. Days passed like a dream, each one bleeding into the next with a sameness that should have been boring, but somehow never was. Elena fell into a rhythm, sleeping through the mornings, waking as the sun began its descent, spending her evenings in that room with a boy who didn't speak. She talked to him about everything. Books she'd read, movies she'd seen, the theory that parallel universes existed where every choice she didn't make played out. She read to him, too. Fairy tales at first, then adventure stories, then whatever caught her eye from his extensive shelves. He never responded with words, but his responses came in other ways. The tilt of his head when something interested him, the way his eyes tracked her movements. The night he'd picked up a book and held it out to her, a request, his first communication. The household operated around him like clockwork, without visible gears. Food appeared in her room at sunset. Always fresh, always perfectly prepared, never quite what she'd expected. The fire stayed lit. Her laundry vanished and reappeared cleaned and pressed. She never saw anyone doing these things, never encountered Mrs. Crane except for brief passings in hallways, when a woman would nod and continue on her mysterious errands, and sometimes, late in the evening when she walked the corridors between her room and the boys', she felt him, the master, watching from shadows, his presence a cold pressure that made her spine tingle. He never revealed himself, never spoke again, but she knew he was there, checking on his son, checking on her, making sure she kept her promise that on the seventh night, something changed. She was reading The Secret Garden, all about hidden places and children who heal by being seen. When the boy stood up, Elena stopped mid-sentence, watching as he crossed the room with movement that was eerily graceful, too smooth for a 7-year-old. He stood at the barred window, small hands gripping the iron, and looked out at the night. "Do you want to tell me about it?" Elena asked gently, closing the book. "About why you don't talk?" He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the question with anything but a tightening of his fingers on the bars. But something in his stillness felt different, felt like maybe he was considering answering in whatever way he could. "You don't have to," she continued, "but I want you to know I'm listening, and I'm not going anywhere." She stood, moved to stand beside him, careful not to touch, but close enough that he'd know she was there. "I'm not like the others. I stay." Outside the window, the ground stretched black and silver under moonlight, gardens gone wild, trees that looked like they'd been planted in some ancient time when the world was younger, beautiful and terrible, like everything in this house. The boy's head turned slightly toward her, not quite looking at her, but acknowledging her presence. His lips moved, shaping something, not sound, but intention. Elena held her breath, waiting, hoping. Then he lifted one small hand and pointed, not at the gardens or the moon or the distant line of forest, at a shadow near the tree line, something that moved with predatory grace and terrible purpose. "What is that?" Elena whispered, more to herself than to him, but he answered in his way, reaching up to touch his own throat, then pointing again, a story told in gestures. Whatever was out there, it had something to do with his silence. The shadow moved closer, and in the moonlight she could make out a shape, humanish but wrong, proportions just slightly off. Too long in the limbs, too fluid in its motion. It circled the house like a shark circling prey, and Elena felt the boy tense beside her, felt fear radiate from him in waves. Then the shadow stopped, raised its head, and even from this distance, even through the window and the bars and the space between, Elena felt its eyes find them. Find him. The boy made a sound then, the first sound she'd heard from him, a sharp intake of breath that was almost a gasp, almost a cry. "It's okay," Elena said, moving on instinct, stepping between the window and the boy, even though the gesture was meaningless, even though whatever that thing was could probably come through stone and glass and bars like they were nothing. "It can't reach you here." You're safe. But the boy was shaking now, trembling like he'd shatter, his eyes wide and fixed on that shape in the darkness. Elena knelt before him, blocking his view, taking his shoulders gently. Look at me. Not at that. At me. His eyes dragged away from the window, found hers, and she saw terror there, pure and absolute and devastating. The kind of fear that came from knowing exactly what a monster could do, because you'd already experienced it. I'm here, she said firmly. I'm right here, and nothing is getting past me to hurt you. Do you understand? His hands gripped her arms, small fingers digging in with surprising strength. That's it. Hold on. I've got you. The temperature in the room dropped precipitously. The fire in the corner dimmed, as if something was sucking the warmth away. And then he was there, the master, the father, appearing between one heartbeat and the next with his terrible beauty and his eyes full of murder. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the window, at the shadow beyond, and his expression was death itself. Go to Miss Reyes's room. His voice was barely audible, barely contained. Now! Elena didn't argue. She took the boy's hand, felt him grip back with desperate strength, and moved toward the door. But she couldn't stop herself from looking back, from seeing the way the vampire king stood rigid and furious, from watching as he moved toward the window with intent that was purely lethal. They ran, not in panic, but with purpose, Elena's hand tight around the boy's as they navigated the dark corridors. She'd expected him to slow her down, but he kept pace easily, his small body moving with that same unnatural grace. They reached her room, and she locked the door behind them, knowing it was useless, knowing that whatever was out there and whatever was back in that room wouldn't be stopped by a lock. But it made her feel better anyway. The boy stood in the center of the room, still shaking, his eyes distant with memory or fear or both. Elena led him to the chair by the fire, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and sat beside him. You're safe, she repeated. Whatever that was, your father won't let it near you. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw questions in his eyes. Questions about how she could be so calm, so certain, so willing to protect him when she was only human, only breakable. She wanted to tell him she'd spent her whole life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, that it was the only thing she knew how to do well. But before she could find the words, before she could explain, the door opened. The vampire king stood in the doorway, and the sight of him stole whatever breath Elena had left. There was blood on his hands, black in the firelight, viscous and wrong. His clothes were torn, but his expression, when he looked at his son, was nothing but relief. It's dead, he said simply. It won't threaten you again. The boy made another sound, that same almost gasp, and then he was moving, crossing the room faster than Elena could track, throwing himself at his father with force that should have knocked them both over. The vampire king caught him, held him, and for a moment his careful control shattered completely. Elena saw raw emotion cross his face, love and fear and something like devastation, before he buried it again. She looked away, giving them privacy in the only way she could, watching the fire instead of this moment that felt too intimate to witness. Behind her, she heard whispered words in a language she didn't understand, heard the boy's silent sobbing, heard a father trying to comfort a terrified child. When she finally turned back, the king was looking at her over his son's head, and his expression was complicated. Gratitude, maybe, respect, and something else she couldn't name. Thank you, he said. Just that. But it felt like more. Elena nodded, her throat tight. Is he safe now? For now. He stroked his son's hair with surprising gentleness, that blood-stained hand careful against the small head. But there will be others. There are always others. His eyes met hers, held. You should leave. While you can. This isn't a safe place for someone like you. Someone like you. Human. Breakable. Mortal. He was giving her an out, a chance to run before the danger consumed her too. The smart thing would be to take it, to pack her single suitcase, and call a taxi and never look back. No, she said instead. I made a promise. I stay. His expression shifted, something like wonder mixing with the darkness. You're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both. She managed to smile, though it felt fragile. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving him. Or you. The last two words slipped out before she could stop them, unplanned and honest. His eyes widened fractionally, and she felt the weight of her admission settle between them like a living thing. She'd just told the Vampire King she wasn't leaving him, had claimed some kind of connection she had no right to claim. But he didn't correct her, didn't laugh or dismiss or destroy the moment. Instead, he held her gaze and said quietly, "Then stay, Elena Reyes, and help me keep my son alive." It was the first time he'd used her first name. The intimacy of it shocked through her like electricity, warm despite the cold that always surrounded him. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched as he carried his son back to Boy's room, the child clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a dissolving world. When they were gone, when she was alone with just a fire and her racing thoughts, Elena understood that something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't just a hired help anymore. She was part of something dangerous and strange and desperately important. And walking away was no longer an option, even if she wanted to, which she was beginning to realize she didn't. The attack changed everything, not in obvious ways. The routine remained the same. The household still functioned with an invisible precision. The boy still didn't speak. But underneath, in the spaces between words and gestures and stolen glances, everything had transformed. The Vampire King no longer avoided her. He appeared in the boy's room most evenings now, ostensibly to check on his son, but Elena felt his attention on her too, watching, assessing, trying to understand what made her different from all the others who'd run. She was starting to wonder the same thing herself. What possessed her to stay in a house where shadows had teeth, and the master was a creature from nightmares? But every time doubt crept in, she'd look at the boy, at the way his eyes tracked her movements, at the small relaxations in his posture when she entered the room, at the fact that he'd started sleeping finally, curled in his chair while she read, and she'd know. She stayed because he needed her, because for the first time in her purposeless, invisible life, someone actually needed her specifically, not just anyone who could do the job. His name is Adrian. The Vampire King's voice came from behind her, making her jump. She'd been sitting in the library, a room she discovered on one of her wandering afternoons, full of books that smelled like time and knowledge. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, still as sculpture, his eyes on the book in her hands. In case you wanted to know, his name, Adrian, Elena repeated, tasting it. It's beautiful. She set the book aside. Why haven't you told me before? Because names have power. He moved into the room with that gliding grace, stopping near a window where moonlight turned him silver and shadow. To know something's true name is to have power over it. I didn't trust you with that power. And now, he was quiet for a long moment. Now you've proven yourself trustworthy. You stayed when that thing came for him. You put yourself between danger and my son. That means something. Elena stood, drawn toward him by something she couldn't name. What was it? That shadow. His expression darkened. A revenant. A vampire who's lost themselves to madness and hunger. Once he was someone I knew. Someone who served this house. But grief and time corrupted him, turned him into that thing. His hands clenched. He blamed Adrian for the death of his mate. Blamed an innocent child for an accident of birth. Adrian's mother, Elena said, understanding dawning. She died when he was born. In the birthing. Yes. His voice went hollow. She was human. The pregnancy shouldn't have been possible, but love makes fools of us all. I thought I could protect her. Thought my power could keep her safe. I was wrong. He turned from a window, and the grief in his eyes was sharp enough to cut. Adrian survived. She didn't, and he's been paying for my mistakes ever since. Elena's heart clenched. Is that why he doesn't speak? Because of his mother? No. He moved closer to her now, close enough that she could see the inhuman beauty of him in detail, the perfection that was just slightly wrong, too symmetrical, too cold. He stopped speaking the night a member of my court tried to kill him. 3 years ago, they held a blade to his throat and told him if he made a sound, if he cried out for help, they'd kill everyone he loved. So he stayed silent. Even after I found him, even after I dealt with his attacker, he hasn't spoken since. Horror washed through her. A child. Someone hurt a child like that. Someone who believed a half-human child had no place in a vampire's world. Someone who thought they were protecting our kind's purity. His laugh was bitter. I executed them publicly. Made an example. But the damage was done. Adrian locked himself in silence, and I haven't been able to bring him back. Elena reached out without thinking, her hand finding his arm. The cold in him shocked through her, but she didn't pull away. He's not lost. He's just scared, and he's protecting himself the only way he knows how. She squeezed gently, but he's starting to trust again. I can feel it. He held a book out to me yesterday, asking me to read. That's communication. That's progress. The vampire king looked down at her hand on his arm, at the warmth of her against his cold. You believe that? Truly. I do. She met his eyes, those terrible, beautiful eyes, and didn't flinch from what she saw there. And I think you need to believe it too. Stop seeing what he's lost, and start seeing what he still has. He has you. He has me. He has a chance to heal, if we give him time and patience and love. The king finished. You were going to say love. Yes. Elena's voice softened. He needs to know he's loved. Not despite what happened, but through it. That you're not going to give up on him, even when it's hard, even when it takes years. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, carefully, he covered her hand with his own. The temperature shock was intense, his fingers ice against her skin. But she held on anyway. You speak from experience. Someone didn't give up on you when you needed them. My mother... Elena smiled, though it hurt. When my father left, when everyone said I'd end up just like him, worthless and gone, she stayed. She worked 2 jobs, went without sleep, sacrificed everything so I could go to school. She never gave up on me, even when I'd given up on myself. Her eyes stung. Now she's sick, and I can't fix it, can't make it better, can't do anything except pay for treatments that might not work. So I understand what it's like to love someone and feel helpless, to want to protect them but not know how. His hand tightened on hers. That's why you took this job. Why you're really here. Yes, the money. She laughed, shaky. Mercenary, aren't I? Devoted, he corrected. Loyal. Willing to face monsters for the people you love. His thumb traced across her knuckles, a touch that should have been casual but felt anything but. You're remarkable, Elena Reyes. Do you know that? Her breath caught. No one had ever called her remarkable. Invisible, yes. Useful, sometimes. But remarkable? Never. I'm nothing special. Just a girl who couldn't afford not to take your money. You're wrong. He pulled her closer, and she went, drawn by something deeper than attraction, stronger than fear. You see through surfaces to the truth beneath. You looked at my son and saw a child, not a monster. You looked at me and saw a father instead of a killer. His free hand came up, hovering near her face, but not quite touching. You're special precisely because you don't realize it, because you think protecting others is ordinary when it's the rarest gift in the world. They stood like that, close enough to breathe each other's air if either of them had needed to breathe, and Elena felt the moment crystallize around them. Dangerous, impossible, absolutely real. She should step back. Should remember that he was a vampire king, and she was his employee. She maintained a professional distance that kept her safe. Instead, she whispered, "What's your name?" His expression shifted. Surprise, then something deeper, rawer. "You don't know?" "Mrs. Crane never told me. You never said. I just think of you as..." She stopped, unsure how to finish. "As what?" "As him. As Adrian's father. As a person who loves a son enough to hire a stranger and hopes she doesn't break what's already broken." He was quiet. So long she thought she'd overstepped again. Thought he would draw and return to being the cold, distant master. Then he leaned in, his lips nearly brushing her ear, and spoke his name like a secret, like a gift, like the most dangerous thing he could give her. "Corvus," he said. "My name is Corvus." And Elena, holding the name like something precious and fragile, understood that she'd just crossed another threshold, that knowing his name His real name, spoken in his own voice, meant something profound in this world of vampires and power and ancient rules she didn't fully understand. Corvus, she repeated, and watched something fierce and possessive flash through his eyes at the sound of his name in her mouth. Say it again, he commanded, and this time his hand did touch her face, cold fingers against her warm cheek. Corvus. Her voice barely qualified as a whisper. His eyes darkened, red deepening to something almost black, and she knew with sudden certainty that she was in terrible danger, not from violence, but from something far more devastating, from the possibility of wanting someone she couldn't have, shouldn't have, wouldn't survive having.